Okay, thank you, Brodie. So I should explain we've had we've done some preparation for this bit in that all of the speakers have suggested questions, and we've done a little bit of sifting and organising of those questions, and we've come up with 4 themes for this section. The first concerns definitions, really, ontological questions, I suppose, about what is art, what is environmental art, what is landscape architecture. There's a danger that could take over completely, and we could spend the whole 40 minutes talking about that, so I'll be keeping an eye on that. The second theme is really about where we are now, what is happening in environmental art today. The third theme is about the influence of environmental art on landscape practice, landscape architectural practice. And then the final theme is about education. So that's the overall structure. And I'm just going to ask the questions and invite responses from I thought a possible starting point, actually, you all know the Jellicoe tow rope theory. This is Geoffrey Jellicoe's idea that artists are the pathfinders, and that landscape architects or landscape designers sort of follow in their train. And it's easier for artists to experiment than it is for landscape architects, because landscapes take such a long time to build and grow. And he argued that in the 18th century, this relationship was very close. And then in the 19th century, everything went wrong because, well, other interests involved, like horticulture and plant display. We've got the Gardenesque and things like that. And Jellicoe rather looked down his nose at that sort of thing. And then along came modernism to the rescue, and landscape architecture followed closely upon modern art, and that was its salvation in the 20th century, according to Jellicoe. And you could perhaps say that this continues with the phase we're in now, that environmental artists are doing the experimenting, and landscape architects are, again, following in their train. I only throw that out as a hypothesis. You can tear it to shreds if you want. Anyway, so the first question really is what is the difference between landscape architecture and environmental art? One of our correspondents pointed out that you can have a work, Walter de Maria's Lightning Field was the example, that if you were neither a landscape architect nor an environmental artist, and you were taken to see this work and you were asked who produced it, it would be impossible to say who it was, which profession produced it, which discipline produced it. So there's the question, the first question: what's the difference between the two things? And I invite responses.
How are we going to respond?
I don't have a protocol for this. I think you just jump in.
Oh, shall I jump in? Oh, I've jumped in. I'm Scott Farlow. Brodie very kindly described some of my work. I've also previously taught on the landscape architecture program at the University of Gloucestershire. I'm a landscape architect by background, but I've always felt that I am an artist and a poet, and so I've now been working for myself as an artist and a poet, a socially engaged artist, for 14 years now, goodness, and sort of weaving together my practice with teaching and research, and a lot of my work's about collaboration. So anyway, this is a fascinating question, and we kind of struggle with definitions, but maybe we could look at distinctions. And one of the things I've been thinking about is the idea of intentionality, the idea of, the intentionality of purpose, and in the sense that art practice is about, for many, is about the idea, it's about the process, functionality or otherwise, and perhaps in terms of environmental and ecological art, it's about the message, the sense of how we convey messages and also how they're received. And it's kind of like a meeting point. And I was thinking, in a sense, landscape architects do explore environmental issues through their practice, but I think a lot of their work is implied. Perhaps there's a sort of hiddenness to landscape architecture in relation to environmental issues and climate change. Whereas with art practice, perhaps it's more about the expression, it's more often overt, perhaps in your face. And in a way, art perhaps draws attention to issues and draws in an audience. And in so doing, perhaps there's a sort of conversation or some sort of reawakening. As Thomas Saraceno says, his work's about an amplification of notions and emotions, and the idea of reattuning to other species and more than human ways of inhabiting our shared planet. And as Agnes Dean said, and Brodie mentioned Agnes Dean's earlier, art is about digging deep. And in the digging, there's a revealing. So anyway, I could say loads. Perhaps someone would like to share their thoughts.
There's a kind of polemical side to art, perhaps, which I don't think landscape architects make very good polemicists.
No.
Is that Andrew Stonyer?
Yeah.
It says Linda, so that's a bit.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm on my wife's address. I don't think we get very far with making distinctions about what land art is, what environmental art is. I did architecture at the AA, and I did 7 years training to be a sculptor. Through that time, we've had environmental art, we've had happenings, we've had installations, and I think one gets fed up with it. It's a bit like the Impressionists being called the Impressionists, and none of the Impressionists wanted to be called Impressionists. I've not met many so-called land artists who want to be called land artists. I don't think land art is something that has suddenly arisen. And I care for the environment in terms of art is not something that has suddenly arisen. I got very interested in, well, what the Greeks had done, 2,000 years ago. And if you start to read the Chronicles of Pausanias, there is an incredible description of a sculpture there that made a sound like the plucking of a single string violin at the rising and the setting of the sun. And that opened up a whole new area to me. I've walked part of the Holy Road, which goes from Miletus through to Priene, through to Ephesus. And that was quite a revelation, because most of it is still paved, and as you walk along it, you can see where the sculptures went. And there was enormous avenues of sculptures along. I think another thing that comes to mind is Mycenae. I'm going back in time again purposely. But as you leave Mycenae on that road, you look across the mountains and you see laying down Agamemnon. That simulacrum working incredibly well. Why was Mycenae built there? Well, one theory is that it was built there because as you looked east, you saw Agamemnon. And you really do see it in that in that landscape. In terms of coming up to the current, well, we've had kinetic art, and it's been with us a long time. You know, I'm thinking of Calder work responding to the most delicate of air currents. I'm thinking of Ricky is the same. American, both. And I think one person that we have left out, and his work is, I think, incredibly prophetic at the moment, is David Nash, who made the ash dome, which now has ash dieback. And you'd see those ashtrays now, they are black. And that is real testimony to what we are doing to the environment. That's my point of view. I think I don't go in for these categories at all. And I don't go in for the great distinction between landscape architects, or artists. I think we're all the same. There's a sort of zeitgeist flowing through it all, to which we all subscribe in some way or other. My two examples of this was Walter de Varia's Lightning Field, and done by an artist, but would you know it was an artist, not a landscape architect. And then there is Walker's Monument to 9/11 in New York by a landscape artist. A landscape architect. Would you know? I mean, when you look at that monument, that is a work of art, and it's a colossal work of art. I just think we've got to be very, very careful. I think one thing that I was aware of during the 60s was that there was, this is going back to Leeds, because I was first year master in architecture for 2 years at Leeds, that there was at that time an incredible mix between artists and architects. No one thought they were more special than the other. And that sharing led to some remarkable work. I think also there's this feeling in architectural training, and I was at the AA, for God's sake, do something that you'll never be able to do again. And I can remember a scheme there, which was a student had worked out that actually London was going to be flooded. This was 1970. So we did a scheme in which London was flooded. And the only way to get about London was by boat. And examiners started to look at this and they thought, actually, I'm looking at his statistics now, and it is not so daft. And it wasn't long after that, and this was seen by the Mayor of London, that they started talking about the Thames Barrier. Well, I'm going off a bit now, but I just hope I've made that point. And really what I'm getting at is, I think, to talk about this distinction between artists, landscape architects, and to actually try to say land art started, well, middle of last century. It's quite spurious, and it's getting us nowhere.
There is certainly a historical element to this, isn't there? Tom, would you like to come in at this point and just say a little bit? Because you asked a couple of questions about, you talked about periods in history where the relationship between art and designed landscapes was very close.
Well, the two periods in the history of art that I had in mind were the neoclassical period as it affected landscape design, and the early abstract art, which, I mean, when the landscape architects I've known heard talking about art and how it's influenced them, what they've had in mind is sort of constructivism, suprematism, neoplasticism. There seems to be something about that period that influences them. But Ian, going back to the point that Andrew has just been making, what it set me to thinking about was your own proposal in your book that landscape design can be monovalent, bivalent, trivalent, and I think that in that categorization, I see the artistic endeavor as being a monovalent approach. And I'd like to ask if you'd agree with that.
Gosh, it's a long time since I wrote that.
It was a very good book, though.
Yes, I think it holds up fairly well.
So do I.
So I can think of landscape architects who act a bit like artists, shall we say? So I mean, the Martha Schwartz kind of approach, which may not pay much attention to environmental issues, and I think wasn't there a notorious example where she worked on a project with a village and they all hated it. So, the kind of social aspects tend to be a bit lacking, but in its own way, it's excellent, And then you can have an approach to landscape architecture which covers any two of these fields, or the trivalent idea was that you manage to bring all three together. So it's something which is aesthetic, something which has an engagement with community, with society, and also is environmentally sound. But you can imagine a piece of work which ticks all of those boxes, but it's still a bit dull. So anyway, it was just a framework for trying to consider what we do, really. And it seemed to me that there were these three different areas, and various landscape architects would put different emphasis upon them.
Now, I've always found it to be a very useful framework, but I think that it kind of goes against what Andrew was just saying, that they're all the same. It seems to me that
I don't think they're all the same. I have to say, I think so. I mean, one of the other questions that was asked, in fact, it's your question actually, Tom. If a design has a function, for example, a food crop, water storage, or recreation, does that diminish its status as a work of art? So the question there is, it's design versus art. It's
what's the answer?
I don't know what the answer is.
When I come in here,
yes, please.
I'd just like to follow up on this idea. Well, I think it is important to examine what the differences are. I agree with what Andrew Stonyer said about we don't need to call it land art, landscape architecture, but in some ways we do. I don't think the term land art or environmental art are useful because artists do not use those terms really. Very, very few people describe themselves as environmental artists. They describe themselves just as artists or contemporary artists. So I think, or visual artists. So I think we're a bit behind, it's a bit backward looking to sort of try and categorize and call this certain kind of work, because many, many artists who don't describe themselves as environmental artists are making work about environment, about climate crisis, and so on, as we know, like Olafur Eliasson. And so the issue for me is not whether, something is environmental art or not environmental art. The issue is, what are landscape architects missing out on if they do not pursue landscape architecture as a experimental and innovative practice that I think artists do? So artists don't have rules. Artists wouldn't be having these kind of discussions about trivalent things. They'd be saying, what are the issues? How do I make these things? How do I experiment? How do I change perceptions? So, Can I ask a question
about? Can I ask about
go ahead.
Where artistic motivations come from? I mean, are they all entirely personal, or do they come from what's going on elsewhere in the art world? What other artists are doing, or do they come from society?
Simultaneously, all of those things. You can't. Sorry, I'll let someone else comment, but I just wanted to raise a quick list, more as a question, see if anyone else wants to pick up on this. I made a list of sort of contrasts. Artists tend to study or look at what is broken. Landscape architects tend to study how to fix things. Artists ask questions. Landscape architects tend to give answers, solutions. We see ourselves as having to give solutions. Artists study, they look at dystopian, ironic, subversive, anti-ideals, whereas landscape architects tend to walk towards ideals, quite utopian ideals. Artists tend to make work to shock or disturb or to wake us up. Landscape architects tend to make work that pleases. And please come in and sort of contradict these artists, because I don't think they're fixed categories. And I think so. I'll just throw that out there because I do think there's a difference there.
I mean, if I could say,
Trudi, you're muted. Did you want to come in?
That's when I was umming and ahhing. I didn't get to speak. No, it's fine. Andrew opened one side, Kathy opened the other, and it's interesting coming from a landscape architect background. You said also, Ian, that artists are pathfinders, and I think I went into the arts because I wanted to find my own path in and my own dialogue with the landscape that I didn't feel I was getting following just purely landscape architecture. So I spent 20 odd years doing that, not full time. I've been teaching landscape architecture, so I've had the balance of the two. And I don't think we should box up what I do. I haven't been able to. When I write my website, I go, what am I? What do I do? I like to say just artist, because but an artist with breadth of work. And I think that openness. So you're saying, Kathy, landscape architects do that and artists do that. I think the inspiration I get is from artists and also landscape architects, but those particular professionals they cross over the ones that I like. The ones, say, landscape architects, maybe Hargreaves, the breadth of, you're placing sculptural form, you're making sculptural form, land art, space, and also, I don't know, they cross over into the gallery world, but also artists that cross over into that spatial world I'm inspired by, but also, like you had the example of Chris Drury's legend. I was completely inspired by the breadth that I looked and explored the landscape, from gallery artifacts to land art pieces, and land art pieces that had function. His reed heart, where it's an earthworks and it's a reed bed, and he's come at a completely different approach. I don't say, which one, but I think the breadth is really key to keep that exploration of site and place and solutions, or not solutions, creating a message. So it's a difficult, this first question, because I don't have an answer, but I do feel the similarities of the two professions. It's those people and why I like them, and I think it is to leave breadth and that openness to explore.
Thank you. Andrew, did you want to come back in? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think, we've got to be very careful here with this elevation of artists. How do you deal with somebody like Damien Hirst, where through Saatchi, through White Cube, he now has a factory. He's worth millions. And it was a very, very cynical ploy about how to work the art market, and that whole Cool Britannia was. Artists are not always that innocent. Neither are landscape architects. That's my point. But, artists can be driven by the market, make no mistake about it, just as landscape architects can be driven by developers.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit more then about where the interesting action is, if you like, in the art world at the moment. So I know that some speakers have been rather skeptical about this sort of story that's told about land art and environmental art and so on, and it, as a kind of progress. But let's just run with that for the moment. Where do you think we've got to now? What are the concerns that are interesting to artists at the moment. Are you going to say that, you know, there's a huge range, it just depends on the artist?
Yeah, I'd say that, but also I'd say that race, gender identity, diaspora, poverty, exploitation, and interestingly, of course, climate crisis, if you want to call it that, environmental issues. I think one of the things I'd say that landscape architects are really well placed to actually make, let's call it art, environmental art, and yet they don't. Tom referred to not at this point to the installation at Somerset House. And that would have been far better if it had been done by a landscape architect. I know they did have a, you know, so I guess what I'm saying, yes, huge diversity, and it's constantly changing. So the kind of discourses that you get in contemporary art move on very, very rapidly. It'll be, and are constantly changing because that's in the nature of the practice. And I wonder if it's also true for landscape architecture. Are we moving fast enough with our ideas and practices?
I suspect we move much more slowly. And I suspect we're always looking back at the, I mean, if there is anything in the tow rope theory, I think we're probably always looking over our shoulders at something that's already gone, you know.
Can I make a quick comment, even though I'm not in this section, that I agree with Andrew that my initial slideshow was basically to set up a dialogue that you could shoot to pieces, because I think the mistake that landscape architects are making is thinking that art is a decorative element to place in their landscape. And they're also making the mistake within their own design field, thinking that landscape architecture is this tick box exercise of fulfilling environmental concerns. And they're missing the trick that landscape architecture, as with art, is a cultural operation. And that's why, as Kathy said, you know, contemporary themes are picking up on race and diversity and equality, these new agendas, non-physical agendas. But landscape architects aren't, because they're, as you said, they're behind the curve. And so both artists and landscape architects are making mistakes. You know, landscape architects are inviting artists in to decorate their landscapes in a way that is not very rigorous, because design is a rigorous process done well, and art is a very bad process if there's no rigor. And they're both not communicating, you know, on the same level. Artists have moved on to a more cultural theme, and we're behind talking about the science. Whereas, you know, you can't change climatic issues unless you talk the language of culture, not science. So there's a sort of disjoint. And so, you know, bring on the day, as Andrew said, when originally there wasn't a distinction. You know, artists were designers and designers were artists because they all work together. And then what is the next thing that'll come out comes naturally, you know, through collaboration.
Jumping ahead a little bit to talk about education. We ran a project once. It was landscape architecture and some fine art students, and it was to design a courtyard in the medical school at Newcastle. And we gave them all the same brief, and we put them. I think they were working in. No, they weren't working in groups. They were working individually, and all of the art students produced an object, you know, a piece of sculpture generally, to put in the middle of the courtyard. And all of the landscape, no, they were working together. I'm wrong. They were working together. But there was no crossing of the boundaries. So all of the fine art students automatically produced an object to put in the courtyard, and all of the landscape architects produced a kind of garden in which there would be an object. None of the landscape architecture students thought about treating the whole courtyard as a piece of art, and the artists didn't do it either. You know, they stuck with their one object rather than the whole space. It was terribly disappointing.
We did a project like that, but we put the fine artists with the landscape architects, so there'd be a group of 4 of them. And,
yeah, and I think we did something similar. It was a while ago, and I was a bit hazy about it. I think that's what we did. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, it wasn't necessarily, it ended up like an art installation, so it wasn't just an object, and it was very resonance of that place. It was with the Public Arts in Wakefield in their grounds, and it was just the fine artists couldn't believe how narrow the brief was, and the landscape architects couldn't believe how broad and open it was, and that there wasn't this function to follow. And I think just querying, not just on the education side, I just think on the commissioning process, I don't know whether I'm in the right area to talk about this, but the commissioning process, I find I'm landscape architect trained, I practice as an artist, but I like the way in which I'm commissioned as an artist, because there's many ways I can have a residency, which gives me much time to explore. That watershed project you showed, Brodie, that was over a few years. I got some funding to explore with scientists to get their perspective on that landscape, so that I could come with an environmental installation or some kind of proposal through their eyes, but also the breadth and the I wanted to explore a place without having to have an end goal. So I try and find places where I can have that commissioning process where it's a bit open. I'm in a project at the moment where I'm with a lot of engineers. I was employed as a land artist. It was quite a narrow brief, but actually it's not just the commissioning process, but it's the expectations of the client as an artist, as opposed to a landscape architect. They know this artist is going to do something. So actually they're very open to, doesn't have to have this function. They do have this perception of putting something in the middle, because I was left in one place around a roundabout to go, it's in the middle. I don't go commissions if to say I want it there. You know, it's about, I think the key difference is that commissioning process. And that's why I stick on the art side, because I feel I come up with different thoughts and approaches through that commissioning process for an artist. And sometimes I'm commissioned as an artist or a land artist or an environmental artist. When I did the one about watershed, I knew I was just going to do an exhibition. So the expectations was an exhibition, but I think that's key, because we don't have time as landscape architects to have that luxury. And whether
you have more freedom, do you think?
Yes, less expectations, and that you would have to create a functional space or a solution. But I will come up with and my approach doesn't start with that function. So I don't know what I'm getting or approaching, and it's a surprise to me. And I just think it's much more open, and the work goes in ways you wouldn't expect. I think the place dictates it, or the situation.
How do other people feel about that?
I'd just like to add something. I think Trudi's experiences are really important here in terms of the sense of freedom one gets through an art commission, where the expectations are different to the sort of formalities of a landscape design project, I think. And this sense of allowing place and context and people and memory and history to form a dialogue with us as an artist, to then come up with a response that speaks back to the place, the context, and maybe sometimes answers the brief. So I think it's really interesting, this conversation, in terms of how landscape architects perceive art, and this idea of, you know, well, what is art? I'm not an artist, I'm a landscape architect. And I think this flags up lots of thoughts and conversations around status. I think it flags up lots of conversations around a fear of art, a fear of not losing control, a fear of, or a misunderstanding around what the potential is for collaboration. So collaboration itself is profoundly important, and a sense that landscape architecture just has this really functional role to play in the world, and yet it's uniquely placed, you know, to inform and influence environments and the way people experience and interact with the environment and each other, and uniquely placed to respond to and reflect back issues around social justice, around cultural issues, around climate change, around, you know, and I think there's a fear, there's a kind of running away from all this stuff. Oh, we can't deal with this because we're dealing with SUDs or, you know, block paving or something, and yet we deal with things that grow, you know, ecology, natural systems, time. And I think there's something really profoundly, I don't know what it is, something profoundly unique, but also it suffers from that at the same time. You know, there's a kind of tension and a duality there that just doesn't make sense to me.
So Scott and the other educationalists, or past educationists, Ian's original question was about education, and I've got two points. First of all, what's your response to how much more should we teach art to design students at our universities, and what are the barriers to that? And secondly, are we scared to not be professionals? Because it seems to me that we are scared. We are trained to be professionals, so we're scared to not be professionals. And where the extra creativity lies is the other side of that fence, and the barrier is professionalism. So what's your reaction to how much more should we teach art to designers, and that professional issue that's holding us back or not?
Kathy, that seems to be right up your street.
Sure, yeah. I just want to say I also really agree with what Scott articulated, that kind of, you know, the whole potential of landscape architecture as an art form, and the contradictions in there really well. And Brodie, yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think we need to teach. I think it came up in. Trudi raised a question before the event about what is it we're learning when we learn creative practice or art, let's call it, and is it the processes, is it ways of thinking, is it studying other disciplines, who other cultural disciplines? So I think we're not very good at studying other cultural disciplines and being aware of contemporary culture. We tend to just look at other landscape architects' work. So I feel the answer to your question is yes, very much so. We need a much more rigorous cultural and creative practice education. So I think it's partly about creative practice, experimental practice, doing things, experimenting visually, which is not often given a lot of time for. And then there's being aware of an outward facing environment, say what's going on, what are artists doing, what are architects doing, what are musicians doing, what are other, you know, what's happening in theatre and so on. So I think it's both experimental practice as well as being aware and knowledgeable and informed of other creative disciplines.
Can I concur there? And I think it's really, really interesting that we are having this conversation around, well, we could set aside landscape architecture per se for a moment, and art per se, and you know, let's talk about the sense of self. Why do students come to university anyway? You know, what's the intention? What's their purpose? What do they want out of the experience? What's university for? What's a course in landscape architecture trying to achieve, in the sense of, you know, liberating the creative spirit, as well as providing some tools to go and do something useful? You know, there's this sort of imbalance, I think, and yet we are all innately imaginative. That's part of what it is to be human, and I think there's a kind of severance of that in the academic world, where you have to have some tools to perform a useful function, and that's good. But there's also a sense of context, as Catherine so eloquently put, you know, about a cultural context. You know, what else is going on out there? How are other people working? What inspires us? And it might be fine art, it might be poetry, it might be music, it might be the wind in the trees, it might be birdsong, it might be the oceans, and what concerns us, and how can we fold all these things into our teaching, but also into our learning. You know, this dialogue that's so important and enriching. And
well, maybe we need to look at,
I think it's really interesting,
what the barriers are to doing this, and I think there are barriers within the profession. So when I wrote that book 20 years ago, a lot of it was based upon interviewing practitioners. And I remember one of the questions I asked people was what they thought was good. You know, what were the examples of really good work? And somebody said, oh, I think a lot of the work we've done in reclamation is really good, as long as it's not, I forget the exact word, but not spoilt by poor attempts at land art or something like that. It was a sort of very negative dismissal of any sort of artistic aspiration there. It was just about reclaiming the land and doing it well. So there's all of there are people within the profession who are not particularly interested in this subject. And then, of course, we have the accreditation tick boxes to meet. You know, there's an awful lot of knowledge that has to be imparted to students, and it's growing all the time.
And that I find that, Ian, sorry.
Sorry.
That I find that over 25 years of education, I did much more art-based work in the curriculum, much more with all levels, and I find it's changing because of that list, or because of a list, because they've got to be ready with skills. We don't make oven-ready landscape architects, but they've got to be ready with skills, and we've got to put within that this sort of wider base of inspiration. And I find it's reducing, and to understand you've got to be just inspired, but you've got to practice the process and see the difference, and then you're aware of it.
Some practitioners would like us, as you say, oven ready, or plug in. You know, you plug in the new landscape architect and it works.
But it's employability as well. It's from the students or from the parents. They want a job at the end of it, but it's getting them to be more open-minded. So when they're in practice, they won't look back and say, that's what we want, the skills. We also want that drive, the originality, the open thought. You know, that is a skill in itself, and it's just been dampened down a lot. And I think it depends who's in the university and the teaching, and whether you do have those bodies to put that in, and if you don't, you won't get it. So like you say, not everybody's interested in it, which is key to expressing yourself, creating places that are have a sense of place, sensitivity, looks at the current and originality of it, and yeah. So I could go on, so just let other people.
I think there's a link here between sort of teaching practice and the frustrations therein around, well, the tensions about creativity and practicality, all this stuff. and that plays itself out into the professional world, doesn't it? You know, and what do landscape architects do? You know, and what is their role in the bigger picture? And it's a sort of self-perpetuating system, isn't it? You know, it's like, this is what we do, this is how we teach what we do, and so it goes. And it's a very difficult situation to kind of pause or break, pull it apart, and say, well, where is this potential that we have acknowledged here today? You know, around this uniqueness of our profession that is somehow special at bringing together lots of different skills, responding to context and specifics of place and local distinctiveness, as well as looking at ecology and the connection between space and buildings and the human experience, as well as looking at how we communicate all that. You know, where does all this stuff come from? Who are we dealing with? And this idea of collaboration and the idea of weaving human narratives into the process, I think is really, well, I think it has vast potential. And you know, so it goes. I'm not really sure what I'm saying, but I'm just saying that, you know, we're kind of we could deal with it academically, transform the learning and teaching experiences, but that doesn't meet the expectations of the professional world or the institutions or the institute or whatever. So, you know, this dialogue needs to be stretched and taken out. And somehow this fear of art, I mean, it's absurd, really. this fear of expressing our imaginations, or this fear of not being able to experiment with ideas and test things and break things.
Scott, I like the phrase by Emilio Mbaz, who's an architect, Argentinian architect. He said, all designers, architects, landscape architects, the whole lot, they should be specializing in the poetics of the pragmatic. And he said, if you think that's a contradiction, then it is. And that's a good thing. But for me, we've specialized too much in the pragmatics and too much within the knowledge of the pragmatics. And we've forgotten the poetics, and that poetry is linked to art. It's part of art. So that when you look, as Tom will tell you, when you look back at history, at the 18th century, when they were almost amateur landscape architects and architects. I mean, Vanbrugh was just a set designer. They got it right on the money, and I know they were dealing with, you know, aristocratic clients, but forget the kind of politics of that. What they were creating was poetic, enduring landscapes that still stand today. And my question is, are we doing that? Are we doing that as landscape architects? Are we creating poetic, enduring landscapes? Or as Trudi said, are we just creating this giant checklist of environmental concern, a knowledge base, as though we're robots? And I think I've implied the answer. So I'm quite concerned about the direction our education is going in. Do you agree with that or not?
I do agree, Brodie, very much so. Because I think it relates also back again to what Scott said. There's so much potential. You know, landscape architecture is an incredible discipline. It's not very well known. And there is so much potential for all, you know, art projects to be landscape architecture projects. And yet we don't put ourselves forward, say to art competitions. We don't put ourselves forward. We don't present ourselves with a cultural face as part of contemporary culture. And I don't know whose responsibility that is, but somehow there's something that just kept perpetuating itself. And we don't seem, we should be the most important cultural discipline of the 21st century, given what's happening environmentally, and yet somehow we're not in there. We're not in the mix. They're not aware of us as a cultural discipline who has ideas. You know, even in people's plans, local authority plans, or energy plans. You know, landscape architecture is so central to that. Carbon neutral environments. Where are we? We're not visible. Is it because there's not many of us? Is it because we don't really have confidence? Is it an issue of confidence? I don't know. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant, but I do feel it's such a tragedy that we have hugely important things to do and make and say, and yet somehow they're not out there in the contemporary imagination. Yeah.
Tom raised in the chat the name Thomas Heatherwick. I've met Thomas, interviewed him for a book actually once. One thing he's not short of is confidence. You know, very articulate. I can see why he's done so well and got to the eminence that he's reached. I mean, I know a lot of people criticise him. But you know, a fount of ideas and imagination, and also very good at putting them across, I think.
Thomas calls himself a maker, not an artist or a designer.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
But he's certainly doing things that could easily be classified as landscape architecture. I mean, this contentious park in New York at the moment, which is this island park. Cost a vast amount of money, and it's a tiny little pocket park out in the Hudson, I think. But, I mean, I met him in the context of the blue carpet in Newcastle, and the whole idea of that was he was using broken bottles, the blue glass from bottles, as a paving material, and he made a great thing of this in the interview I did with him, and I even put the project on the cover of the book, which was about construction. It didn't work. It wasn't blue. It didn't stay blue. If you go and look at the blue carpet now, it's a grey carpet. And I think that's, you know, following his career, there's often been moments like this where things just not come off, or they haven't been enduring in a way.
He's very strong at singular concepts that win competitions, and he was a great part in winning this competition for us. But then it unravelled because he said, I want to take the major fee for the architecture because I came up with a major idea. And we said, well, you know, it ain't going to work. What a shame. And the ironic thing is that when we presented the winning idea to the client, I had to end up doing the art. So the client asked for an arts participation idea to go along with the architecture. Heatherwick refused to do the art. So I did it, and that got the most applause from the client. But the client said, well done, Heatherwick, that is a great art idea. And I went, I did it.
So the question for us all is how we turn this around, you know, how can we operate a little bit more like Heatherwick, but do it better? Well,
I think you said it yourself, Ian, you know, the one thing, you know, let's not dwell on Heatherwick for too long, but, you know, you said there's this sense of confidence, and with that there's this idea of being flexible, this idea of ideas, for one thing, this idea of being adaptable, and also a willingness to actually collaborate, which means listening, which means true collaboration is about, you know, let's work together and see what comes out of this, and it's about ideas, and you know, I think this sort of approach starts with students and having these conversations around, well, you know, let's respond imaginatively and openly and willingly, in fact, to a context or a place or a brief, and I think the problem is, you know, we like labels, don't we? You know, I am an artist, or I am a whatever I am, and it's like, I don't think that helps actually. You know, let's just be what we are, and what we are fundamentally is imaginative and thoughtful and empathetic and hopefully authentic, with an interest in the world, and an interest in the human experience, and an interest in how things grow, and an interest in how we look after things, and all this kind of stuff. I think we've gone so far down the line into this checklist, as Trudi so tellingly said, that there's no room to maneuver. So let's chuck the checklist away and just start with a conversation, and look at the potential of art, the art of design, the art of conversation, the art of inspiration, the idea of sharing ideas and working together and responding to the story of the place, or the being inspired by the smallest of things. We look at Heatherwick as an icon and an inspiration, but let's put that to one side and look at the place itself and the people who live in that place and the stories they have to tell, for example. And I think there's so much enrichment in being present, being in the place itself. So and I think trying to have difficult conversations is a difficult thing to do, but it sounds like that needs to happen. And of course, being honest is really important. What are we scared of? In fact, with the 6th mass extinction and climate change as it is, we're just emerging out of a pandemic, which we might not be emerging out of. The fact is, what have we got to lose, really? What have we got to lose? And we know systems break. We know that systems have broken. And I think let's be more emotive, more evocative. Let's have conversations that revolve around feelings and not be scared about this, because I think it's really important that we talk about nature as an experience, not as a bloody object. It's like and listen to the birds singing and the murmuration and all the rest of it, and be connected, I think.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Ian, do you want to kind of sum up now, Ian, and elicit any last questions?
I think Edward wants to come in. Is that?
Yes. I'd just like to pick up the point about the 9/11 work and Peter Walker in New York, because I was lucky enough actually we were going to work together on a competition. Well, we did work together on a competition, and I worked in his office for only 4 days or so. But it was, and that was the period just before he was going to be. No, it was the period when he was sort of receiving the commission for the 9/11. Well, it was a competition, of course. But I suppose what's really interesting in the relationship which he has with Heatherwick is they're both really confident people. And he was, in the sort of in the evensong of his career, he had a very efficient office which worked with him. He had about sort of, 25 people or so, a wonderful model shop, and he was very, very politically shrewd to be able to, he realized the sort of politics of working in New York was incredibly difficult. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is, what I would like to say is, I think to make sort of big poetic, artistic statements, which are just happen to be landscape architecture, I think you have to be very clever in the politics, and also maybe you because of our education system, possibly there's an advantage if one's had a lot of experience that you leading an office have the opportunity of expressing yourself in a very artistic way, because that can be delivered by people who are working with you. Whereas if you're in the early stages of just starting, possibly it's much more difficult because you're not used to dealing with the politics of committees, etc., etc., etc. So maybe the opportunity or the responsibility of creating wonderful landscape pieces of poetry needs to go just as much to the people who are in their mature ages as to the young, who would find it possibly more difficult to deliver.
Can I thanks Edward, can I kind of move to the third and last stage, which is quite easy. But can I quickly make an interjection on the issue of 9/11 Ground Zero? I don't know whether people realise it, but actually Peter Walker didn't actually design the concepts of the 9/11 memorial. That was an architect. I forget his name.
Arad.
Sorry, what was it?
Arad.
Yeah, and all correct. And all Peter did was the landscape design around the memorial. So that was the paving and the trees.
But he designed the water.
He didn't actually. The architect designed the drops where the foundations of the Twin Towers were, including the entire concept of the materials, the drops.
Okay, that's interesting. I understood that he designed the water drop.
Well, we'll look into that. We'll get Tom to look into that. But my understanding, there was a bit of a bone of contention between him and the architect, because the architect said, I won the competition to do the memorial and you were employed to do the landscape.
Sounds familiar story.
I think Brodie's right about that.
And the landscape consisted of the paving and the trees, and they were nicely done. But let's be honest, the big emotional pull is not the paving and the trees, it's the holes with the water coming down, the black stone, and those perforations in the names around the top where people put roses.
Well, that's really interesting because I met him during that competition, and he told me he gave me his side of the story.
Well, I mean, yeah, Peter Walker is.
Anyway, my point being confidence.
Yeah, Peter Walker is a true master, and perhaps we ought to just be teaching students to be way more confident, but not in a Damien Hirst way. With a bit of integrity at the end of the day. Anyway, in terms of questions, most of them were from Tom. So just in closure, I'd refer to Tom. Is there anything we haven't answered?
Well, I've got about another 122 questions, but maybe there isn't time.
Well, is there anything in particular that we didn't answer?
I think really the best thing would be to plan another debate, Brodie, because there really are such a lot of issues.
Yeah. Okay. And just lastly, Andrew Stonyer, as a designer but a non-landscape architect, do you think we've made a little bit of headway into exploring the relationship between landscape design and art?
I think so. I mean, I think the issue really is don't be so timorous. Make a bigger sound.
Yeah.
Much bigger.
Be more confident.
Champion yourself.
Yeah, be more confident. And once you're confident, learn the professional bit retrospectively, not the other way around. Okay, thank you very much for that. And Ian and the speakers will edit the recording and put it on YouTube and social media.